Hello and welcome to this special recording that we've put together to celebrate the recent release of a new exciting report by Dr. Pat Jones, who's with me now, entitled Discovering the Common Good in Practice, the Catholicity of Catholic Charities. You're very welcome to this discussion we're going to have about Pat's work, what's been achieved and some insights from the report. So we'll just say who we are and then introduce the discussion ahead. So, Pat.
I'm Pat Jones. I'm a researcher working in the sector of Catholic charities.
And I'm Clive Chapman. I work with Caritas Social Action Network, which is two things at once. We are both a network of around 45 Catholic organisations in England and Wales that were set up largely to address the poverty in terms of material destitution that exists in our country, and to build up community life in the interests of the common good of all people who live here. And secondly, we're an agency of the Catholic bishops in England and Wales, which means on the one hand we might be called upon to provide advice on social policy issues, but equally we can speak with a legally independent voice, both to represent the voices of the charities and to extend the range and depth of Catholic social action. Okay, Pat, we're going to talk about the thesis you've completed with Durham University, but I think it would be really good if you could start off just by summarising what this research is about and who's been involved with you.
So the research started from a question about whether Catholic social teaching, that kind of body of texts and ideas that comprise the Church's social vision, its vision for how society should be organised, about how that related to what happens on the ground, to what Catholic charities do. So that was where it started from, and I wanted to do it in a practical way. So in planning the research, I approached CSAN and some of its members to see if they would join in. So in the end, I worked with 6 charities, and I think I interviewed 27 different people and also led 6 focus groups, which meant that I had an enormous amount of data, about 110,000 words of what people had said. And then out of that, I tried to pull some ideas and insights that came from charities' actual experience on the ground.
Great. So a good cross-section of experiences that you were able to call on there, and presumably quite a lot of time you spent listening to people in those contexts. But you've been on a much longer journey, both as a Catholic and somebody working closely on the inside of Catholic organisations. Could you say more about that longer-term journey you've been on that's led you to the point of doing this research?
Well, I suppose in my Catholic faith, social action has always been really at the forefront for me. When I was young, I was involved in something called YCS, Young Christian Students, which is the student version of YCW. And I think I learned then, when I was quite young, that our faith means that we have to try and change the world around us. And then in later parts of my working life, I've worked for Catholic charities. I was deputy director of CAFOD for some years. And then I headed up a secular charity working with prisoners. And then latterly I worked for DePaul International, which is a Catholic housing charity, a homelessness charity. And I'm still a trustee of DePaul International and part of their work in 7 different countries around the globe. So it's part of my practical experience to look for the ways that the Church can be effective in carrying out its social mission, but also to try and see what the Church and its teaching has to say that's useful to people, because people often tackle it in a very practical way. They see that their faith means that they should be good neighbours, but I think we have to do more than that. I think we're also called by our faith to try and shape the society that we live in. So I suppose I've just grown up in that outlook, and it was a pleasure and a privilege to do this research, because it was so fantastic to listen in depth to the people in the charities I worked with. They were all in some way involved with either homelessness or social welfare. And some of them were specialists, working with young people, one with women who were affected by prostitution, and some were more generic, working with a range of different groups. But overall they were incredibly encouraging and inspiring. So for me, this has not just been an academic journey, but a faith journey. I think there's a great deal of genuine good news in what is being done as part of Catholic Social Mission at the ground level, and it spreads not just from the ground but also up to national level.
Absolutely, it's inspiring work. And anyone in particular who's been an inspiration for you on that journey?
Well, that's a tough question. I look back to when I was young and think of my parents. I hope we all think of our parents in that way, because they brought us up to be Catholic social activists. But over the years, I think it's more the ordinary people I've met at local level who were doing extraordinary things, whether they were CAFOD volunteers, or I'm thinking of somebody in Salford who's running a large homelessness project that feeds 170 people a day. She would describe herself as a very ordinary person, yet what she's doing is simply stunning. And you can see the evidence as she walks around the place, and her passion, her drive, combined with her ordinariness, in that she knows what life is like for people, and she lives at that base that where most people's lives are. So that's what I find inspiring. There are great popes and there are great theologians, but it's how people pick it up at a local level and get determined to change lives for the better and change communities, and they do that.
And was that a general theme in the people you talk to? Why do they get involved? Obviously, it's desire to change things for the better, but were there any other things you heard about why people start off this work in the first place?
Well, of course, in the people I was interviewing, the people who work in the charities, either as staff or volunteers, aren't all Catholic. They come from different faith viewpoints and different ethical backgrounds. But the point about the charities is they work together under the hospitality of a Catholic social vision expressed in lots of different ways. So it was particularly interesting for me that I was interviewing people who, some of whom had clear faith inspiration, but many others, well, sometimes they didn't even really know why they were doing it. They were attracted towards a particular work, and I think it's in the doing of it that they discover that it matters to them. And they are often quite, they find it hard to express it, so they'll say things like, well, we just want to make lives better for people. Or when I asked, I remember one worker saying, when I asked what she'd learnt from her work, she said, well, it brings out the goodness in you. So their ways of expressing what their motivation were often, they didn't have a hugely explicit language for it. But that was part of the value of doing the research, I think, because it's only when you're asked that question that you try and find out for yourself what your reason is.
And did they contrast their experience in Catholic charities with their times in other welfare contexts?
A few of them did. They were more likely to contrast the freedom of a voluntary organisation as compared to the restrictions and constraints of working in the statutory sector. So, for example, I think they were all felt that the statutory agencies tended to work in silos, and they could only do certain things and they could only help in certain ways, whereas they spoke with relief and passion about how the charities can take a holistic view, how they can have an open-ended process with the people they work with. They can welcome people back if they come back a couple of years on. They don't have to finish the journey of accompaniment. So I think it was more the freedom of working in a voluntary sector agency that can develop its own mission rather than a comparison with other voluntary agencies that was powerful.
Looking at the organisations themselves, all of these charities are legally constituted in civil law, and most of them will be registered companies too. Your portrayal is a major part of your exploration in a Catholic context suggests they're creating spaces that are not quite fully an arm of the state on one hand, not quite fully church, if that's understood as everybody in that organisation being in communion with the bishop. As you've said, they come from lots of different backgrounds, and they're also not purely a civil society organisation in the way church documents might define civil society as far as they do. But equally, these charities embrace some of the interests of each of those three types of being a charity, being an organisation. Do you think people thought about this when the charities were first set up? Was it a deliberate choice to be something that straddles all of those dimensions? And if it's something that's developed over a longer period, how perhaps just an example of how it's come about in real life.
Well, that's an excellent summary, Clive, of quite big passages from my research. Thank you. I think in most charities and most social mission develops according to circumstances, so I don't think they set off deliberately to be like this. And in any case, in the fascinating and largely untold history of Catholic charities, you have charities from the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, when the church was just getting re-established in this country, and then you have charities that were established in the 80s, in the recessionary times when poverty rose. You have charities that were established in the 50s, just as the welfare state was settling in. So it was quite an important part of their history is which period of history they were founded in and what they were trying to respond to. But also the church has changed a great deal. And I think in earlier decades, before Vatican II, there was an assumption that Catholics built Catholic institutions that were full of Catholics. The true story was never as simple as that, because even the earliest charities, quite a few of them used to help people of all faiths and none. But after Vatican II, when the church enlarged its vision to reach out in dialogue with the whole of the modern world and to recognise partners in those who cared about the same issues, then charities also responded. And since in this country a particular part of the tradition has been that rather than set up, for example, Catholic political parties, the history here shows that the church, in a hurry to get kind of socially established and recognised from the 1850s onwards, knew that it could no longer expect the earlier model of what you might call Christendom, where we tried to get a state that was run along Catholic lines, but rather had to join in with the existence of a liberal democratic state and work out how to influence through its values and its presence and its contribution and voice. And that's I think the pattern that's followed through to the charities even today, that they work in partnership with what's left of the welfare state. Some take funds from the government, some don't, but they would all expect to try and improve or challenge or call to account the welfare systems of the country. And they try and make a contribution that goes beyond what the welfare provision can do, but also that models something that has an important witness in it as well. So I think they're complex organisations with each having its own narrative, but they are trying to... I think what's interesting is that I would say they exist on the boundaries of the church in some ways. In fact, it made me ask the question, where does the church finish? Where is the edge of the church? Because we know where parishes are, and we know where Catholic schools are, and even Catholic colleges and universities. But when you come to the charities, the Catholic charities, because of the way social welfare works, it's hard to say, in a sense, whether they're inside or outside. They're sort of both and, I think. They're living across the boundary is the term I used.
Yes, I think that particular chapter of the thesis is one I found particularly electrifying because there are, in only 3 years in this role, so few really useful syntheses and accounts of that history and why things are the way that they appear to be. But I'm looking at the global tradition of Catholic social teaching, the formal tradition. How far do you think the kinds of things we're talking about have been encouraged, this approach that you've described so far in church history?
Well, I think we also, in this research I was looking very specifically at the context of England and Wales, not even Scotland and Ireland, to be honest, because the story of the Catholic story is different in each country. And I was also conscious that I was reading a lot of American material and realising how different the context in the USA is, because the church has had such a different history and profile there. And I think around the church internationally, I think we have to recognise that the local church, the church in each country, has had to find its own path. And so in that sense, perhaps it's not surprising that the documents that come out from Rome stay quite a high abstract level, because they can't possibly write them in a way that takes account of all these different histories. So even in Europe, for example, the difference between the history in France and the history in England. You know, France is a Catholic country in a sense right through, perhaps losing its Catholicity in the 20th century compared to earlier times. That's very different from the history of persecution that the Catholic community had here. And all of these things shape how the church carries out its social mission.
And one of the central arguments in your work is that the charity's own worldviews and their quite profound struggles could be better recognised in the institutional church's social vision. Even so, despite what you're saying about needing to remain abstract and not being able to incorporate all those diverse accounts, but you argue that these charities' experiences in some ways are not that well represented in the church's vision and in its teaching. And I'm not going to give away all the full insights of your research findings here, because people need to read that and have that excitement themselves. But could you unpack a bit for us, particularly at national level in England and Wales, why this recognition of the charities' worldviews hasn't occurred earlier?
That's a tricky question. I think partly one of the things that becomes very clear when you look at what the charities do is that some of the work is quite specialised in that you need to really know about housing, or really know about homelessness, or know about legislation, or know about particular approaches to how to work with particular groups that are struggling. So there's a field of expertise there that the charities build up. And at one level, I think it's hard for the church to listen to that and work out what to do with it, partly because the people who are leaders, the bishops and priests, that's not their field. And therefore you have lay people with expertise on the one hand and priests and bishops who we understand to be teachers of the faith on the other. And it's hard to work out how to bring those two streams together. It's not that I don't think the bishops and priests care about the issues. I think they do care, and they give a lot of support to what the charities are doing. But I suppose the question I'd ask is, do they really understand the challenges that they face? I think it's a great thing when bishops are willing to be on the trustee bodies for charities, or when they get involved by visiting and accompanying and begin to learn what they're doing. I know that's difficult because they have so many other calls on their time, but I think what I would like to see is a far stronger dialogue between the experience of the charities and those who in some way teach or preach in the church, so that we can pass insights backwards and forwards, because it equally seemed to me that those who are heavily involved in the practice on the ground of what the charities do are so busy with the daily reality of the people that come to them, the services they provide, that they find it hard to have time to stop and think about what are the ethical frameworks behind this, or whether a Catholic theological worldview offers a challenge that they need to think about. So it feels to me that there's a gap in the middle, and so there are certain things that would help, but the struggle is time and resources, and perhaps also leadership. I mean, I think that's probably one of the questions I'd ask. Where would the initiative come for that kind of process? CSAM plays an invaluable role in the middle, but it also has limited resources. I would like to see a kind of theological accompanier employed in every Catholic charity, and that's really difficult for charities to resource.
Yes, and of course Caritas International has an ecclesiastical assistant in Rome, and we've been very privileged to receive some of his work in the last year, some of his addresses, which are always quite helpful, but as you say, that's not widely available in many organisations. So we've talked a bit about how the Church recognises and takes on board the experience of the practice of charity in these organisations. And let's look at it from the other way around then. You've extended the debate about what it means to be a so-called Catholic charity today. So just looking at that in sort of two different ways. First, sort of Catholicity is a sort of black and white concept. Do these charities exclude people from being an employee, or saying you can't get support from us on faith grounds?
No, of course not. Partly because they work in a legal context where they're not allowed to do it. But I don't think they would want to do it anyway. So one of the really good pieces of work that the Bishops' Conference has done in recent years is a set of guidelines on equality law, in which it makes it quite clear that the Church's teaching completely supports the principle of equality and its expression in law. I mean, obviously there are some sensitive points in there, and there are some ways in which the Catholic charities would want to protect their rights, for example, to appoint Catholics to particular posts, but those are quite limited and these days have to be well argued. But I think what's, for me, the more interesting thing here is that to see that the fact that the charities have an inclusive workforce, that is to say, people from different faith backgrounds and different ethics, I would see this as a strength, not as a deficit. For me, this is the most important thing. I find quite attractive the idea that we discover who we are most fully when we encounter people who are different. And in this setting, I think it's the fact that people come and perhaps ask questions, perhaps see things differently, perhaps bring other instincts, other insights, perhaps just bring what you might call the goodness of their hearts, which they didn't get, wasn't influenced by a faith tradition, but perhaps by upbringing and in different ways. And they contribute that to the work of the charity. And one of the ways I describe the charities is as hospitable spaces in which it's a positive strength to bring a personal faith commitment or a personal ethic from different traditions, and then work together under the overarching framework, the horizon of the Catholic social narrative offers. And I think in many subtle ways the charities do this. I was fascinated going around the charities to see that there are all sorts of little signs of it, whether it was kind of the pictures on the wall, the statues, the things you could do freely, the things you could talk about. And quite often in the public sector these days and in other places, that people seem to assume that being a secular society means that everything to do with faith and religion should be kept private and out of the workplace. Whereas these are charities in which it's welcome and fine to be Catholic, but it's welcome and fine not to be, and what you bring is to be valued. And therefore it's comfortable that people pray and that Muslims do prayers in the director's office, or that there's an icon of the prodigal son, or if you went halfway up the stairs in De Paul's offices, you found a traditional statue of St. Vincent de Paul sitting in the window ledge. So there's a kind of freedom in that doesn't try and edit out faith, but sees it as a positive advantage. And that invites people to be comfortable in lots of different ways. And I think that's also what makes it fascinating as a space, that that people aren't tied into a professional ethic that says you keep all of that out. But neither is anyone ever pressurized into anything. There is great freedom. You know, there are masses in some charities, but they're completely voluntary. There are prayer spaces in a couple of them, but they're open to anyone. And if you use them, it's completely up to you. So I think they achieve quite an important creation of a space which is in which faith is possible but not required, in which different viewpoints are welcomed and valued.
Oh, that's really good. So we've exploded the myth there that a charity that's called Catholic X might just be for Catholics, and it's amazing how that perception persists. We hear that from the charities quite a lot, so it's good to hear from real life research and experience. All the evidence is not just of the opposite, but what you're addressing here is how the deeper question of how the charities construct their values. And you touched on some of the narratives that those values rest on, but also, I mean, the opening question was about being a Catholic charity, and clearly a lot of them take significant sums of money from statutory contracts from the government, which might be vaguely literate around faith issues. How do the charities remain true to constructing and refreshing those values in a way that simply is more than simply just relativism and fudge?
Well, it's I think it's at one level a daily task, and it's made up of lots of different actions at lots of different levels. So what I came to describe as the charity's narrative, and by that I mean their formal texts like their vision, mission and values, because that's always important in a charity, also their histories, their cultures, the vision of their leaders, and the commitments that they've made. So all of that is what people get introduced to, and all of that is how they live, what they live in from day to day. And within all of that, they have to try and negotiate keeping the values alive. One of the things I found is that it really helps if charities have a living link with some lived Catholic faith. So, for example, DePaul UK, on its board and on the board of every DePaul charity, there are representatives from the Daughters of Charity, from the SVP, and from the Vincentian Fathers, if that's possible. And that means that even though it's no longer the case that religious communities run charities in the way that they used to, they remain in contact with people who are living that life fully, and that's a kind of a check on it becoming just a formal piece of paper that they are a Vincentian charity or a charity influenced by Benedictine values. In the Cardinal Hume Centre, when you go in the door, they had a plaque just inside the door with a quote from their founder, Cardinal Hume: "Every human life matters, no single person is redundant." And as one of the staff said to me, we walk past that every day, and I think everyone I interviewed there could quote that back at me. So sometimes they do it by that a simpler means as having something displayed that people walk past. But others, it's down to actual provision of staff training, staff development, which helps them to try and reflect on the values in relation to their work. And what I noticed there is that even though the charities say they're inspired by or founded on Catholic social teaching or gospel values, in fact, the texts which make most impact are their own vision, mission and values. Those are the operative, powerful influences for them. So it's a kind of a mediated relationship. The practice is influenced by the values. The values reflect Catholic teaching or Catholic social teaching or gospel values, and they're kind of guaranteed and kept alive by these live links. And that means that charities can be, quite a long way from the institutional church, but still trying to hold on to that connection to an authentic Catholic social worldview.
Well, we're going to pause the tape there. And in the second part of this recording, we'll be looking at the roles of politics, leadership, and Pope Francis's views on the culture of encounter.